afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Iron Sharpening Iron podcast. And today I'm super excited to have my good friend Sam Bray, all the way out in Salem, Oregon. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Hey, Sam. So you and I have been talking offline, off and on for the last few weeks or so. And I asked you, what kind of was on your heart to talk about today? And we thought about talking about how easy it is for us to forget God in our personal lives. And I thought that was a wonderful conversation for us to kick around today. So I wanted to start the conversation today by going to Numbers chapter 21.
Yeah.
Numbers chapter 21 really is it's a fascinating section of chapter. Matter of fact, verses 1 through 9 is what I would encourage folks to take a look at. And actually, Jesus makes reference to this incident when Nicodemus came to him in the middle of the night for some spiritual instruction. But in Numbers chapter 21, what you have is you have some Israelites who apparently had been taken captive by those Canaanites. And so in their mourning and grief, Israel petitions God for his help. And verses 2, 3, and 4 demonstrate for us that God did in fact give them aid, and they conquered the Canaanites. Now, as God's people are wandering around, Edom refuses them passage. And right away, in Numbers 21, verse 5, we see that Israel does what they had done so many times before and after, is that they complained to God.
Yeah. Mine doesn't say they complain. It says they spoke against him, which is like almost another level too, beyond complaining. Speaking against God. Yeah.
So, I mean, taking it to the nth degree, right?
Yeah.
And so here, very quickly, you see that God has helped them through a crisis. And then almost right away, they forget what God has done for them. And so God punishes them by sending poisonous snakes as cure to kind of help their attitude. But this is just one instance in which God's people forget his majesty and his love and all that he's done, not just for them, but for you and I today. And so that's kind of what we want to talk about today, right? Is how easy we get caught up in our day-to-day stuff and we forget all the good stuff that God has done for us.
Yeah, and it seems like it always happens so quickly where all it takes is one thing to go wrong for us to all of a sudden forget about all the things that are going right in our lives. And, for Christians, no matter what storm you're encountering in your life, you always have, every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. That's what Ephesians 1 says, that in Christ, we've been blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. But it's so easy to forget or to disregard or to take all that for granted. And when one thing goes wrong, all of a sudden we're complaining to God, and it's easy to say, the classic stuff, right? Like, why me? God, are you there? And all those types of things. And that obviously leads and impacts our behavior, which we want to avoid, which is exactly what you see here. They start complaining against God, and God sends those serpents upon them, and God even there is merciful in the end. It's the thing. But yeah.
That's right. He when they finally relent and ask Moses to go to God on their behalf, God does give them some relief. And it's interesting as you read that, it doesn't seem as though God takes away the problem of the poisonous snakes. He just gives them a means by which to be cured, should they be snake bitten. I want to welcome everybody to the podcast today. We have Sam Bray in Salem, Oregon. And if that name sounds familiar to you, Sam is from Seattle, and you probably know his folks pretty well up there in Monroe.
Mhm.
And of course, his grandpa was Lowell Williams, and many of you watching are familiar with who Lowell was. So,
Mhm.
Sam, would you agree with me if I said that we as people, just kind of our human condition, we tend to be forgetful, don't we?
Yeah, I'm super forgetful, and in fact, I just got a text this morning. Somebody was telling me I got to text somebody else that I was supposed to text earlier in the week, and I'm such a forgetful person. I know it's bad. I'm such a forgetful person that, like, my brother, he bought me this thing from Costco that I can sync with my phone, and I can go to the app, and I can locate my keys and my wallet and my phone. It's all linked together. So if I lose one of them, all I need is either my phone, my wallet, or my keys, and I can find the other two. So it's perfect.
That's
But
a
yeah,
good brother right there.
yeah, it's exactly. But I'm a super forgetful guy, and you know, I think all of us, we can relate to that a bit. But then, unfortunately, sometimes for me that spills over to my spiritual life as well, where I'll learn certain lessons. Right? I mean, think about all the lessons we're learning right now. For instance,
Mhm.
we're missing worship with each other. Right? You said you're going to assemble for the first time this Sunday, isn't that right?
We actually had our first assembly this last Sunday,
And
and
so
tonight is our first Wednesday night.
what was that like, assembling for the first time after all this, after this huge break?
It was weird. I almost felt like for the for the weeks that we did live streaming,
Mhm.
I almost felt like I got conditioned to talking to my phone, and then all of a
Oh,
sudden, wait, here's an auditorium full of people, and
yeah,
I can see their reactions and their faces, and
yeah.
it was a little awkward. I have to tell you, it's almost like I
Well,
have to get used to getting up in front of the people again.
well, it's interesting because I know some people that they've been uh, meeting in their homes and kind of inviting more and more people. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I know the first time that they did that, just meeting in their homes, meeting with other Christians other than their immediate family,
Mm-hmm.
people started to tear up when they started singing, and it's like, man, we miss this so much, and through all this we're learning the lesson that worshiping with each other is a very special thing. But how long is it going to take before we kind of forget that lesson that we learned, right? And maybe we start taking worship for granted again. But that's just one example. Sometimes we learn, God teaches us, hey, I took a certain person in my life for granted, and then eventually I forget that lesson I learned, and I take that person for granted once more. Um, and then, when it really starts to spill over is when we start to forget God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I start to reflect my own forgetfulness upon the God who created me. God's not like us. There's things that happen, and we sometimes convince ourselves, maybe God's forgotten about me. Maybe God isn't watching. God, are you there? Um, and this is where that thinking, it's a small leap from saying, God doesn't care or God has forgotten, to now, okay, well, I can just do whatever I want now. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting when you read in Psalm 10, if you want, you maybe want to turn over there in Psalm 10, and in verse 11, it's talking about this wicked man, and how he's kind of oppressing the helpless. And it says that this wicked man in Psalm 10 and verse 11, he says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. In other
Mm.
words, this wicked person, some of the motivation behind much of what he's doing is God's up there in heaven. He doesn't care. He's forgotten about us. And if that's our mindset, then we're in a lot of trouble, obviously.
Let me ask you a personal question, and I don't mean to put you on the hot seat necessarily, but can you give us maybe an example where you have let your forgetfulness seep into your spiritual life?
Yeah, totally. I mean, without even, I guess it's hard to get into specifics sometimes, but I mean, I've made mistakes in my life. And I think growing up, there's certain mistakes that I didn't make just because I saw other people make those mistakes, and so I was fortunate in that respect. Um, but I think just in my dating life growing up, I would do what I want, and I would think God doesn't really care. And then when those relationships would fall apart, I would just completely forget about God, and I would kind of sulk in myself, and kind of turn to other things to soothe myself, to comfort myself, and rather than turning to God, who during that whole time, whenever something bad would happen in my life, he was shaping me, he was molding me, he was making me into something better than what I previously was. But I would use, those letdowns in life as excuse to say, well, God's forgotten about me, and that leads to worse behavior and even worse outcomes. And I think what I've found in my life is that whenever we go through problems, there's basically two wills for your life. Satan has one will. There's something that Satan wants to take you, and he wants to take this heartache that's going on in your life, or this problem that's going on in your life. And there's something that Satan wants to mold you into using that problem. But then God, he has a separate will in your life, but he'll use that same issue, that same problem in your life, and he'll use it to make you better. And so it's all a matter of, which will am I going to follow? Which one am I going to submit to? That's what Romans 6 is. I mean, we're either slaves of righteousness, that's God's will, or we're slaves to sin. And it's one or the other. We're submitting to something. And if we submit to God's will, he's going to turn us into something good and something pleasing to him, which is where we want to be.
Right. For everybody watching on Facebook, we're with Sam Bray out in Salem, Oregon, and we're talking about forgetting God, how easy it is for us as people to do that. And so if you'd like to post a comment here in Facebook, I'll share those with Sam, or maybe you'd like to just share your own experience of when you have forgotten God. We can edify and encourage each other that way as well. Sam, I want to take a minute and just share my own, a little sliver of my own journey. And I've been pretty transparent over the years about my journey.
Yeah.
I obeyed the gospel fairly young. Jeff Clark is who taught me the gospel and brought me to the Lord. But just through my first career, which was a lengthy law enforcement career, I had a propensity for abusing alcohol. And the way I look at that now is, I came to the Lord, and then it seems like not too long after that, I'd forgotten the sacrifice that Jesus paid for my sin. And I went right back into a lot of the things that I had been doing before I obeyed the gospel. And sadly, that seems like that was most of my adult life up until I had professionally speaking, and I think a lot of people watching are aware of this story, but I had been involved in a shooting scenario. And I know it sounds cliche, but it seems like my life just flashed before my eyes, just, in the snap of a finger. And I asked myself a question, like, as this thing is unfolding and taking place, I'm like, if I die right here in this parking lot, am I going to go to heaven, or am I going to be separated for all eternity? And really, it really shook me up, because I think I answered myself, I don't think I'm in good standing with the Lord right now.
Yeah.
And that really was like, I felt like God was shaking me by the shirt, like, hey, get your act together. And so it really caused me to become a more serious Bible student. And that's actually how I forged my relationship with Paul Hawthorne, because it was Paul that, came into my life and pointed me in the right direction and helped me get my train on the tracks and get going in the right direction. And I've been pretty open that, had I not met Paul when I did, I think I would have died drunk in a ditch somewhere. But I'm just sharing that with everybody, because it's very, very easy for us to forget where we come from and forget all the things that God has done for us, including offering up his only begotten to serve as the propitiation for our sins.
Yes.
You know, we like to say, well, Jesus paid the price. Well, he did, but it's much, much more than that. That word propitiation is a very strong word. I think it's used like 3 times in the New Testament to demonstrate Jesus' sacrifice for our sins. So I share my own journey.
Oh, and I think everybody, that question you ask yourself, I think anybody who's got a mature faith has reached that question before, which is, you know, what would happen to me if I died right now? And I remember reaching that same question. And there's people in my life that, you know, I was a bad influence on them and they were a bad influence on me. And it was just bad all the way around. And I remember asking myself that question. And it was so concerning that I finally voiced it. I was talking to this person and I said to him, you know, I gotta be honest, if I died right now, I don't know where I would go. And I remember that person's reply was, oh yeah, I felt that way before. Don't worry, you'll get over it. And I remember at that moment, you know, I was praying about some things and God gave me a big answer right there that there's some people that are in my life currently that aren't going to help me get to heaven. And so some changes are going to have to happen. And that's a painful thing. You know, when your path is over here and God wants to course correct and put you over here, there's a lot of changes and a lot of pain that goes from getting from your road to God's road. And so, yeah, that question is huge. And I think that it's vital that we don't forget that point in our lives where we were asking that question.
And here's another thing, you bring it up. I mean, when I read Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, and Paul very clearly says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Mm-hmm. Well, that scared the death out of me because I realized, okay, nobody else can get me to where I need to go. I am fully culpable for myself. And that really scared me. And seriously, in the year that followed my shooting, as I was, you know, getting sober, kicking my tobacco habit, and really kind of reevaluating my spiritual life, that verse right there served so much motivation for me. So I was like, and then whoever the Hebrew writer is, perhaps it was Paul, I don't think it was, but the Hebrew writer says it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And I'm like, you know, it scared me. It motivated me to, you know what, I need to get my spiritual life in order. Then here's a psalm from David that I think everybody who's watching should consider this. Mm-hmm. In Psalms chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, here's what King David wrote. He says, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you should take thought of him? I was watching a movie here recently, Sam, and one of the characters in the movie made the comment. She says, you know, if you look at the Orion galaxy, I think it is, it's scientists think maybe it's made up of 1 billion stars. Now, I don't know if they can calculate that or not, but the point she made was the God of 1 billion stars knows my name. Mm-hmm. Wow. And you think about what God told Jeremiah in Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Wow.
Yeah.
So whenever I get to a point where I forget God and I forget all the wonderful things he's done for me, I need to remember that the God who made 1 billion stars, that same God knew me. He knew my name before I was ever formed in my mother's womb.
And what's crazy about that too, and I remember making a similar point in a sermon, is like we can talk to that God and take every single problem to that God that knew us from our birth whenever we want to. And I think that's one aspect of our spirituality that we often forget or neglect, whichever word you want to use, is our prayer life, that we can go to the God. Like, it's not only that he knows me, but I can know him, and I can have this relationship with him, an intimate relationship with him, and communicate my feelings and my concerns and cast all my anxieties upon him, for he cares for me. And in return, he's the God of peace, and he'll bless me with that peace which surpasses all understanding, is what Paul describes it as. He wants us to pray to him. And so here you have this God, and he created everything. And it's like, I can take my problems to him, and they're not too big for him, because he created this world, and he knows how the world works, so he knows how to work it out. And it's really powerful. But I think that I don't take it to heart as much as I should often.
Hey, I want to welcome everyone to our weekly edition of Iron Sharpening Iron. We have Sam Bray in Salem, Oregon with us this morning. If you have questions for Sam, or you just want to comment on the things that we're kicking around, feel free to drop us a comment here in the comment section, and I'll share those with Sam as we go along. I see my sister has joined us. And so, Marie, it's good to have you with us. And my sister just got married.
Awesome.
So actually, Marie, you need to change that on your Facebook profile to Marie Perkins, not Marie Downey. So congratulations to my newlywed sister and my new brother-in-law, Jeffrey. You know, you just made a comment, Sam, that has resonated with me for a very long time. First of all, I think we tend to neglect our prayer life. I don't think it's that we forget. I think we neglect it. But Paul makes the point that if we will but pray to God, and that is the cure for anxiety. And when we pray the proper kind of prayers to God, God gives us that kind of peace. It seems as though God protects our heart from the wrong kinds of feelings, and he protects our minds from the wrong kinds of thoughts. That's the benefit that we get from prayer.
Yeah, and I appreciate you making the distinction, but I think sometimes forgetfulness does factor into it, because the reason why we are neglectful to our prayer life is because we forget how powerful God is. We're not mindful of it as we should be. And we forget how much bigger he is than our problems. And, you know, I look at it as well. Sometimes I ask God for prayers and he answers them, and I forget to thank him for it. Yeah. And it's interesting, because I think as you read the scriptures, it's clear God wants a relationship with man. And you can imagine if you were just asking your spouse for things all the time and asking her to, you know, cook or clean or do whatever, and you're never saying thank you. You're just constantly making demands and never saying thank you. That's what kind of relationship is that? Especially since we have a God that clearly shows us that he is, number one, he's mindful of us from the time that we're born, but then throughout our whole lives, he's never forgetting us. He's always there so long as we're turning to him. And I think that's the first thing that we need to remember as Christians is first off, God, he remembers us. And I think sometimes we are doubtful of that. But God remembers us. And when you look at the text, all we have is God proving time and time and time again is that, yes, I'm in heaven, but I have not forgotten about you. And it's interesting. I was doing a kind of like a word study, I guess you could call it. But there's several times, well, actually, there's not that many times. There's, I think, 4 times in the Old Testament where the phrase Elohim Zakar is used. And it's used 3 times in Genesis and once in Exodus. Elohim Zakar, all that means is God remembers, or God remembered. So, you know, the first time that's used is with Noah and the ark. In Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, Noah, he's been on that ark for 150 days, I think it is at this point. And notice it says, God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. And so here is Noah on the ark, and imagine what it's like seeing the world flooded, and you don't know how long that's going to last, and you're 150 days into it.
Mm-hmm.
God forgotten about me? Is God going to take care of me in this, these huge waves and this big storm? And all of a sudden, Genesis 8:1, God remembers Noah. And what's interesting, when you look up that word zakar, it means, no surprise here, it means to remember. So that's how it's translated. But it also can be a technical term for adhering to a covenant. And that's interesting because what is it that God had previously told Noah before he ever even got in the ark, before he actually even built it, in Genesis chapter 6? In Genesis 6, in verse 16, let me drop down to it here. Or actually, that's where's that verse? It's not 16, but either way, it's in Genesis 6. He makes the point to Noah that he's going to establish his covenant with him. And
right, yeah, I'm looking for that now. Yeah. Maybe you, those of you at home, can help us out if you are in Genesis 6. I think it's verse 18.
Thank you,
Sam.
18. Yes, 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And so before Abraham ever gets into the ark, God's already told him, I'm going to establish my covenant with you.
Right.
And so that automatically, God's made a promise to me. And so I'm going to put my trust in God. And we see in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, God hadn't forgotten that covenant. Despite, right, Noah seeing these waves and seeing the waters over the earth, God made this covenant with Noah. He made this promise that he's going to deliver him, going to deliver his family, and he's going to establish his covenant with them. I just find that to be really encouraging.
We have Jim Portillo is a brother of ours that we worship with at North Seattle. And Jim gave us a lengthy note, but I just want to read part of it to you. He said, it's easy to let forgetfulness take over in life, especially during a busy season of life. He says, for example, working, long commutes, extracurricular meetings sometimes cause us to unintentionally put our spiritual lives or relationship with God on the back burner.
Totally.
Jim, that's a great comment. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think Jim is right on. In the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus says there's 4 types of people, and those 4 types of people will respond to the gospel differently. Yep. But one of those, I think it's the third one, he says people will obey the gospel, but because of the cares of life, they get swept away or pulled away from spiritual things. And so it's a really easy thing to let our kind of day-to-day slice of life kind of stuff pull us away from the important things.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy 13, 7 through 11, I think, is a section where the law of Moses talks about putting spiritual things first, not forgetting our God.
Totally. And they're reminded not to forget, how God had delivered them, to how he had delivered them out of Egypt. They were to remind, their descendants of how God had done all these wonderful things for Israel. But, obviously living today as a Christian on the other side of the cross, to your friend's point, it's really easy just again to get caught up with day-to-day life. And I think that's where Satan gets us most often is, we're always looking for the big things, not to mess up in the really big ways, right? But Satan isn't always trying to get us to make one big mistake. If he can just get our eye off the ball, if he can just distract us, that's all he needs to do. He's already won. And so we need to constantly just be mindful of God and as best we can, as he's mindful of us. So I appreciate that comment. But you look at, again, Noah, And even you go to chapter 9 and verse 16, and we have all these like stories growing up that just become kids stories, right?
Right.
And I think that we fail to appreciate them, and we look at them as being stories just for kids, but they're stories. This book was written for the people of God. And so in Genesis chapter 9 verse 16, let's see here, let me drop down and find that.
I've got it if you want me to read it.
Yeah, go for it.
It says, when the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And so, verse 17, God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all the flesh on the earth.
And so every time, we see that rainbow, and every time it rains, I live in the Northwest, it's just raining all the time. But every single time the rain stops before the world is flooded. And I think we take for granted that we see that rainbow in the sky, and here we are, some 2,000 years later, and God is still mindful of us. He's still governing the laws of nature and is protecting us and keeping us alive and remembering this covenant that he made all the way back then. And so everywhere you look in the text, I brought up one, God remembered Noah, but then it says in Genesis 19 verse 29, I'll just refer to it, God, he saved Lot, but it says that he saved Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah because God remembered Abraham. And so God saved Lot on the account of somebody else's righteousness, which I think is a powerful thing. But then even Rachel, right? God remembered Rachel and made it so that she could bear a child, so that she wasn't barren anymore. Exodus. You could
bring in Hannah, right? The story of Hannah is so powerful. Look how emotionally distraught she was. Come on, Eli thought she was drunk when she was praying in the temple, and no, she was just upset because she had not been able to have a son, and yet the Lord remembered her and ended up blessing her with a son.
Yeah, and what I love about Hannah too is it fits perfectly with what we're talking about, because, man, you got to feel for Hannah, because I think what a lot of us don't understand culturally now is, like, back then, unfortunately, women weren't treated as well as they should be, and that wasn't God's plan. I think that's just how the culture was working back then.
Right.
And so if you didn't have a child as a woman, you're just looked down upon. And so her rival, the other wife of her husband, she was mercilessly picked on for the fact that she couldn't have a child. So she was distraught over this. She prays for a child, and she prayed that, God, if you bless me with this child, I'll dedicate him to you. And of course, what does God end up doing for Hannah? He blesses her.
He blesses her with not just a child, because in the Jewish culture, it wasn't just enough to bear a child. You were a real woman if you bore a son.
Yes, a son,
to carry on the family name, and also in hopes that maybe your son's going to be the Messiah. So, heavy burden for a woman in those days to not be able to have a child, but God does remember her. He does bless her. And to read the text, all the antagonizing that was going on from Penina towards Hannah, you probably just, made the pain 10 times worse, that she was feeling. So you do have to feel for her. And it's a very powerful story. But point is, and we're trying to make the connection to us today, right? How easy it is for us to forget the blessings that God has given us. Hannah remembered God, and she did exactly what she said she was going to do. And she did, in fact, take and offer her son to the Lord to service unto him.
Yeah, and think about how hard that would have been to send her child. Just Samuel was just a little guy when
right. I know.
Sent him off, and here's this child that she prayed for, and obviously was so distraught that she couldn't have a child. Finally, God blesses her with this child, and I think we take for granted how tempting it would be to just no, I'm not actually going to dedicate. I'm going to keep him for myself. Like, how could I? He's my only son. But that's the thing. God remembers her, and she remembers God. And I think that's the question is, the question isn't, is God going to remember us? We see countless times that he does.
Right.
I also brought up the point of God, here's the Israelites, they're in captivity for some 400 years, and they're groaning, they're crying out to God.
Mm-hmm.
They're making bricks without straw, which I don't even know how you do that. Just nothing but mud.
Right.
And their children are being ripped away from them, and they're crying out to God. And it says God remembered the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God starts to act. That's when he begins his plan starts to unfold to deliver them. And so what I don't want us to forget is that God remembers us. But the reason why I wanted to bring up, those 3 or 4 examples particular is because it's clear to me that when it says God remembers or God remembered, that word isn't being used in the same way that you or I use it. You know what I'm saying? Where it's like, how do we usually use the word remember? It's like, okay, that popped into, I forgot. Now I remember, right?
Mm-hmm.
But God doesn't forget things. That's not the point. And what's interesting is every single time you see that phrase, God remembered, Elohim Zakar,
Mm-hmm.
every single time it shows God remembered, and then he goes and does something. And so
right, there's an action tied to it, right?
Exactly. And it reminds me of it's on par with how we look at God's words. God's words aren't the same as man's words. We say we'll do something, and then sometimes we don't do it. But God's words are on par with action. I mean, that's what you see in Genesis 1. God spoke, let there be light, and there was light. I mean, saying it and doing it for God are one and the same. And so when it says God remembers us, it's not just, he's thinking about us. It's God is acting. He's remembering the promises he's made, and he's acting. And so I guess the question then becomes, okay, now what promises has God made for me? You know what I'm saying? And staying focused on those promises.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think where we get into trouble, and I think the whole point of this discussion that we're having is that we can see repeatedly, time after time after time, that when God remembers, and you're demonstrating that there's always an action involved with that, it's our failing. It's we forget the promises we made to him. Let me just give you 2 quick points. Micah, starting with chapter 1, verse 1, going all the way through chapter 2, verse 11, here God is pointing out the judgment of Israel and Judea because they had forgotten all the things that God had done for them. Same with Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 3, 1 through 5 is all about the woe to Jerusalem because they had forgotten everything God had done for them. Mm-hmm. And I think we do get so busy with our lives, our day-to-day lives, that we forget the blessings of God.
Yeah.
If you think about it, that's the whole reason Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, is because we are a forgetful people. And if we weren't to take those emblems on a weekly basis, Acts 20, verse 7, we would forget the blessing of Jesus having suffered so tremendously for our sins. Mm-hmm. And we do. We are forgetful. And I think God knew we were a forgetful people. So, he, being our designer, institutes this Lord's Supper so that we would remember on a weekly basis.
Do this in remembrance of me, right?
Do this in remembrance of me. Paul says when you partake of these emblems, you proclaim his death until he comes again. Why? Because we tend to forget. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We are forgetful people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so funny because when I was talking to you and texting you, it's like, man, there's so many different places you could go to regarding this topic, and you brought up Numbers 21, and here God did something great, and they turn around, and it's like they relied on him the first go around. Why didn't they rely upon him, this time around? They forget his deliverance so quickly, and they start complaining. But you see that theme throughout, and one way or another, it's in our it's a temptation to forget God, and whether Satan plays into it or not, it's a temptation to do so. And one place that I always think of is in Judges, where I think the era of Joshua, as you read that, it's clear as you read it that this is one of perhaps the greatest generation of Israelites that there ever was. So I'm talking about the days of Joshua. I mean, they go in and they're saying, we're not making the same mistakes that we made, the generation before us made. We're going in, we're conquering these Canaanites. We're doing whatever God asked us to do. And yeah, there's some things that happened in that generation as well. But I mean, they just go in, they conquer this land, and you see this great generation of Israelites. It's so fascinating to me because I think it's in Judges 1 or Judges 2. Joshua dies, and that generation dies. And then another generation is comes along, and it says they didn't know God or the things that God had done for them. And I think it's really would be a surface reading of the text to say, well, they just never even heard of those things. They never heard of God. It's like, no, there's no way that they couldn't have heard these stories and these things, but they didn't take them to heart, and they got caught up in their own lives, or they were led away by temptation, and they forgot how powerful God is. And so that kind of sets in motion that vicious cycle in Judges where, they call out to God, they turn away from God. They call out to God, they turn away from God. You see it over and over and over again. And so it's so vital of a lesson to me, just to really be mindful of the things God has done for us. And maybe
How many times in Exodus did the Israelites complain against against Moses and his brother Aaron? Matter of fact, I think if we were to go back to the Numbers 21 account and verse 5, they even complained about the food. Man, you guys brought us out of Egypt. We're sick and tired of this horrible food. Yet that was the food God provided for them to sustain them, and yet they complained about it. There's another fascinating story along these lines, is the Numbers 16 incident, and that's Korah's rebellion.
Oh,
so you got Korah, the grandson of Kohath. Remember, the Kohaths were the sect of the Levitical tribe that could carry the ark. So you got Korah and about 250 other people, and the whole scene in number 16 is these guys are upset with Moses and Aaron, and hey, who makes you, king of all of us, and how come you guys are so righteous? And it ends up with to prove them wrong, God opens up the earth, and about 250 people disappear into the earth, and God closes it up again. And then the people are still upset with Moses and Aaron, like it was their fault that this happened. Just time and time again, these people forget that, hey, way back when you guys were still in Egypt, you complained and cried out to God, and he did for you. He brought you out of bondage. He brought you through the Red Sea. He provided food for you, and all you did was complain.
Yeah. And what I love about this text too is, I think it's a relevant discussion too today. It's like, if God's really in control, and even now he's in control with this coronavirus going around,
right? Definitely.
And yet it's tempting to complain. Whichever side of the spectrum you're on, there's always something to complain about right now, isn't there? And what's interesting to me is, as you read that account in Numbers 16, it doesn't seem to me that Korah realized who they were complaining against. They thought they were complaining against Moses. They thought they were complaining against Moses.
Right.
And I love in verse 10 of Numbers 16, he says, first of all, in the second half of that, he says, would you seek the priesthood also? Like, he's bringing out the fact that God's already blessed us. Like, he's blessed you. You guys have these great positions that you're in as well. But he says, you seek the priesthood also. In other words, are you getting greedy here? And
Right.
finally, in verse 11, he says, therefore it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is it that you grumble against him? It's interesting how we can complain against certain things and certain people, but at the end of the day, God's in control. And so sometimes I wonder when we're offering up these complaints, if sometimes we're not complaining to the people that we think we're complaining to. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And you make a really good point. Let's take in with the last 10 minutes or so that we've got and see if we can't steer this conversation towards what are the things that we tend to complain about, right? I mean, do we realize how blessed we are to be able to live in a part of the world where in all practicality, we can assemble on the first day of the week and we don't fear the government coming through the front door to persecute us? Mm-hmm. I'll give you an illustration. Our congregation here supports a preacher down in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. And that's a part of the world where the Boko Haram terrorist group is pretty prominent. And he has communicated with us pretty routinely about how the Christians down there have been persecuted by Boko Haram. You know, there's parts of the world where if the Christians were to assemble, they would be physically persecuted. Yep. My point is, by and large, you and I don't have to deal with that. Yep. And so we don't appreciate the privilege, and I'm going to use the word privilege here, that we have to freely assemble and worship our God. Yet we come up with all kinds of excuses, you know, why we don't. You know, I sprained my eyebrow, so I need to stay home this morning from worship service.
Sprained your eyebrow. I haven't heard that one.
You know, strained an earlobe or something, you know, stupid. Like, we've got all kinds of silly reasons why we don't go to church, right? And I'm actually say that wrong. Why we don't go to worship.
Yes.
Right. And why we don't appreciate the privilege that we have. You know, this is, and I'm probably going to take off down a rabbit hole that'll kill the rest of our time, but this is the problem. Parents, those of you who are parents, or you're thinking about being parents, this is the problem with select sports and year-round sports on top of that, right? So you take, I'll just give, for example, select soccer, right? So your kid plays for a select soccer team, and there's all these fees, you know, for the uniforms and the tournaments and all this, and families are constantly out of town because little Bobby has a soccer tournament this weekend. And then when the select season is over, then little Bobby is expected to play for the school team, and it just seems like we're playing soccer year round. Well, if you're constantly out of town for a tournament, when are you taking time to worship your God? Mm-hmm. And that's the most important thing you can do, right, is to focus on spiritual things. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of heaven, right? And then in Matthew chapter 6 and 19 and 20, Jesus talks about when I put spiritual things first, then what I'm doing is I'm storing up for myself spiritual things rather than focusing on the physical things in life, right?
Yep.
It's easy to pick up an extra overtime shift because, you know, I need, you know, extra money for, I don't know. My buddy took me bass fishing yesterday for the first time. And actually, I see Sean is watching. Sean, good to have you on this afternoon. So Kim goes, she goes, is that going to be your new hobby, bass fishing? I'm like, I don't know. It's kind of fun. I might need to go pick me up a rod and a reel. But,
yeah,
you know, if that becomes my focus, when am I focusing on my spiritual?
Yeah. And I'll add too, because I played basketball. In fact, one point I was on 3 different teams, you know, so basketball. Yeah, no, I love basketball.
So you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And, but I was thinking about, man, there's this powerful story. And this, when I was training to be a preacher in Los Osos, California, one of our elders, he's one of the best men I know. His name's Tim Barkus. Mm-hmm. And his son is Trevor. another one of the best guys I know, good friend of mine. And Trevor was I think it was his junior or senior year, and he was just having a really nice year playing basketball. He was one of their best players. And they were competing for some championship. I can't remember if it was a tournament, but either way, it was an important game. And the point I want to make here is that the select basketball, the select sports, those can be teaching moments too. You can still involve your kids in those things, but you can teach them how important God is, and still have them involved in those things. And so this is an example of that. Trevor, best player on this team, competing for a championship, and Tim, they used to organize the Lord's Supper in the side of the building. And it was, the game was taking place during evening worship. And so they were organizing it Sunday morning. And Tim comes in and talks to his son, Trevor, and he's tears in his face because Tim is a basketball coach. He loves basketball. He loves sports. And so he's talking to his son, Trevor, and he says, Trevor, he's like, I can't let you play it tonight. And he's fighting back tears. He says, I can't let you play tonight.
Yep.
And Trevor tells me, he's like, I was really mad when he told me that. But he's like, at the same time, I couldn't stay mad because I saw how important God was and how that wasn't easy for his dad to do. But he did it anyways because that's how important God is. He's more important than the championship game. And so this was a teaching moment and something that Trevor reflects on, and still thinks about. And he's a good Christian man to this day.
Man, I really appreciate you sharing that story with me, Sam, because I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. I grew up in a sports household. My dad coached high school ball. I played all different kinds of sports, football, wrestling, baseball, track, and all that other kind of thing. And you're right. There are some tremendous, powerful life lessons that come out of participating in athletics, particularly team athletics, where you learn to work with other people. But we live in a culture and a society that has placed a high emphasis on those things to where we forget the important stuff. And so I appreciate you sharing that story with me, man. That did my heart good because I know a lot of, good Christian families, but even in those families, it seems like, the tournament, whatever it is, soccer, volleyball, baseball, whatever it is, those sometimes tend to take priority over.
Yeah. And all I'm saying too, because I'm agreeing with you, is that instead of using sports to show them, that sports come first, you can have them involved in sports and show them how important worship is. So for me growing up, we travel somewhere, we'll miss the first game, we're going to worship. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And that instilled in me that worship in church, it comes first. These things are fun and they teach us lessons, but worship comes first. And it's a tremendous opportunity to teach kids that, I think.
And you were very fortunate. You had wonderful, wonderful parents. Sam's parents are Dave and Christy Bray. They worship up in Monroe, Washington. And you're very fortunate to have had parents that had the right emphasis. I did some research here recently. I'll be in Seattle in October doing a gospel meeting on Christian home and family. But on the topic of sports, the NCAA here this last year put out some statistics on the number of kids that participate in a certain college sport, and they have all the guys and gals sports. And then the percentage of those kids that go on to play college sports. And then from that, even further, the number of kids that go on to professional careers. Using football as an example, I forget how many kids, played high school football last year, but the number of kids that go from high school to the NFL is like 0.0013%. I mean, it's just a tiny fraction.
Hey, if I wasn't preaching right now, I'd be in the NBA. I mean, I decided to preach instead of go to the NBA, and that was just, So anyways,
the next Larry Bird sitting there in Salem, Oregon.
No, yeah, it's true. We make it like it's everything, and I know that temptation is always there, and yet, really, it's just a small sliver in your life. And now I hardly ever play basketball. I mean, honestly, I don't have time. And so, it's.
Well, and I think what happens is parents get to believing that their kid is going to be the next Michael Jordan, or
Yeah.
their kid's going to be, uh, the next Patrick Mahomes, and so they invest all this time and energy and resources into, hoping that their kid is going to play. Here in these parts, it's Kansas or Kansas State University, and yeah. But my kid's going to be the next quarterback at UW or wherever. And in fact, while sports is a wonderful thing, and I've learned some great life lessons out of playing team sports, particularly football, it's not the end all be all. Spiritual things come first in our lives.
Yeah. And I want to end on, because I know we're approaching time here, along with that, just Colossians. Yeah, Colossians 3 and verse 1.
Okay, go ahead and read that for us.
Yeah, so if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. I preached on this text 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. One thing that stuck out to me is Paul saying in verse 3 that you have died, that we've died. And to that, I think he's making the simple point, you know what? We're alive spiritually, but we're dead to this world. We're dead to sin. And our minds are to be seeking, and our minds are to be set on the things that are above. Those are the two words he uses, seek and set. And so I'm continually looking and pressing on towards that goal. And one thing I brought out in the sermon is like, how do you figure out, how do you determine if my mind is in the right place? And so one thing I brought out was the social media test. And there's some people that aren't very active on social media, so this wouldn't apply to you. But if you're one of those people that's really active on social media, I encourage you to scroll through your feed and see what percentage of posts are about, political things, sports, all of that, compared to posts, about God or any spiritual reference whatsoever. It might seem like a small thing, but the things we post are a huge indication of what we're seeking and what we're setting our minds on, because there's a process that goes into finding that post to share, isn't there? And in finding that article, we're scouring over news sites and just setting our minds on a lot of junk, to be quite frank with you. Mm-hmm. We could be using that time to read scripture or to share scripture and to, be edifying rather than being controversial. And so I guess I call that the social media test. So people have time today, go ahead and scroll through your feed. And I think it's a good indication of where our mind's at sometimes.
Not only the content of what you share, Sam, but also to whom it's being shared from. There's a particular Facebook page that I see Christians sharing stuff from. It's called Mommy Needs Vodka. And I'm like, that's not even remotely funny to me, because it tells me there's a hidden message between the lines. There's an inference that I need vodka in order to operate as a parent. Mm-hmm. And I just don't find it amusing whatsoever. So not only should we be careful as to the content of what we share, but to whom it's being shared from, because it says a lot about us as to what we absorb and take in.
And that's the thing about this text, is that as individuals, we have our own responsibility to make sure I'm seeking and setting my mind on the things above. But then also I need to make sure, am I helping my brothers and sisters seek and set their mind on things above?
Amen.
And I think sometimes when we post on Facebook or whatever, it's just, it tears down more than it builds up. And so I think that's just something to be mindful of. Is this helpful, or is it, not helpful, I guess is the question.
Well, and I think to your point, what is my influence on others, and how am I influencing my Christian friends and family?